Good evening and welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast.
I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sansbury.
Welcome. What a beautiful sunny weekend, first day of spring. And you've spent all weekend binge watching, Simon. Not the latest Netflix special?
I was trying to play with my camera there, but it's just made me look even worse. Yes. I've spent the entire weekend going over and over the full council meeting, because that's an exciting thing to do, is to try to find a ways to squeeze a 6.5-hour meeting into like 55 minutes.
Yes.
But I guess it's easier than doing an 11-hour meeting into 55 minutes.
Yeah, with discussion. Yeah, no, I was chatting with one of the councillors in the week about the hustings, and delighted to report that Councillor Ben Swan has stuck his hand up for Copner and said he'd be delighted to come to the hustings. But I spoke to him on Wednesday, and he was a very happy man to have been home by midnight on the day of a full council meeting.
I should imagine that was an unexpected joy.
A rare treat, I think. I think for all of our local councillors. So the last big event before May the 5th and the elections. So I think when we've covered
May the 5th, May the 5th be with you is
it'll be a very important day. May the 5th, obviously.
It better be for you, yes.
Yes, 27 years this year. So wedding anniversary. So yes, a double whammy, both wedding anniversary and local elections. What more could you ask for? So without further ado, Simon, because there was plenty on the agenda, you're gonna sort of give us a whistle-stop tour of some of the more simple bits, and then we'll dive into the meatier morsels, as well as analysing. Were these genuine requests, or were they simply a delicious setup to allow for leaflet fodder and more trees perishing in the interests of May the 5th?
Political parties campaigning in the local council before a local election? God forbid.
Wouldn't happen here. But interestingly, this week did happen up the A27 with our new friends in Havant, where Labour snuck a cheeky amendment onto a bill which the Conservatives then voted down, and the headlines appeared the next day. Yeah, beautifully orchestrated, and the leaflet presses were rolling at that point. So let's see whether Portsmouth can keep the moral high ground, but I fear not.
Let's indeed see. So the first thing that I wanted to comment on was actually was item 8 on the agenda. Oh, the chimes. The chimes are calling. And that was an update on planning, development, and management, and increased capacity. This is a response to a cabinet decision in February to use £45,000 of corporate contingency fund to increase capacity in that department. It's been mentioned a couple of times in full council meetings before about the concerns of delays in getting planning applications through, and indeed what Councillor Brent, who basically brings a comment to this, is about effectively that there are 9 out of 14 wards in the city that are not meeting the statutory time frame for issuing planning applications, and that means that for example, in Baffin's 174-day wait for a decision. There was a bit of a weigh-in from all directions, really, but the Conservatives were quite vocal about this. Councillor Stubbs pointing out that the majority of these decisions are actually about minor changes, i.e. extensions or changes of use, rather than kind of larger developments like the wholesale redevelopment of Commercial Road or what used to be the Tricon Centre. Councillor Smythe from the Labour group stating that this is bad for our economy and the impression of Portsmouth City Council as an efficient and effective council. Basically, Hugh Mason, the Lib Dem councillor, reported that the department's people short. It is moving forward, and Gerald Vernon Jackson, the leader, was saying that this kind of happens in other areas. But I think the thing that kind of came out at the end of that was Simon Bosher, the leader of the Conservative group, reminding the council group that that at the end of these stats, there's actually there's a household where they're waiting to redevelop their house, so they're having to rent and pay a mortgage at the same time. Was the example that he brought up, that I think he's brought up to full council before. So there's a person at the end of this process. I think is kind of the key thing.
Yeah, and I think that this is one of those ones. It's quite an emotive subject, because I think often when people think planning applications, they think about housing developments and HMOs and new builds and developers, and at that point people have relatively limited sympathy. But when it's about somebody potentially extending up into the loft space, or putting an extension on the back of their house to save them from having to move, 174-day wait, that's 6 months just to get the green light. So you think about that, somebody naively who's thinking about now, oh, do you know what, I think now might be the right time to do it. Well, you put the planning application in this week, with those lead times, you're not going to get a decision till September. And obviously, getting your house knocked about in the winter time is not something most people queue up for.
No, indeed, and kind of and it's interesting because we come later, we talk about the local plan, which is effectively the council trying to find their way to submit to make a submission to the government to say basically the 17,700 houses over the next 15 years that the council's meant to find space for. It's all well and good finding space for them, but if you can't actually get planning permission granted for them, none of them are ever going to actually get built. And if you're thinking about areas of the city that really are in desperate need of regeneration, if you can't kind of get the small things done and efficiently and effectively done, what hope is there for the really complex, large projects that the sort of ambitious projects that you'd hope to be seeing from the council now that it's the property owner in down Commercial Road or the Tricorn. So it's a key thing. On one hand, it does, initially it might kind of seem like, well, who cares about developers, but on the other hand, actually, it's the little guy that's suffering the most, and the regeneration is sitting.
And that's where, for me, and again, I do have some sympathy in the, backlog caused by COVID, difficult to recruit, planners into the role. But ultimately, with a lot of these planning applications, it is a rubber stamp exercise. And, there's a part of me that says, if you were pragmatic, the major estates and the roads in Portsmouth where you've granted extensions and loft spaces, and in the past, there's part of me that says, a couple of weeks with a sifting through the lift with a rubber stamp and just going, yeah, and clearing out all of the stuff that to be noise. And I'm sure that anybody with a council planning background would be aghast at this. Oh no, we've got to go through them in detail line by line. But realistically, this, as you mentioned, this one has been kicking about now for far too long, and no real solution seems in sight. Because £45,000 sounds like a chunk of money, but if you're the person if you're the somebody with the right qualifications and you're in demand, £45,000 doesn't buy you for very long, does it?
Well, no. I mean, also, if they're, it's interesting that although Councillor Hugh Mason pointed out about the systems thinking review, so the review of the processes to make them less onerous, to make them more simplified, and the concerns about kind of IT, the numerous kind of different types of IT that need to be used. And it's all well and good doing that review, and that's great and that's fantastic. And yes, there have been all of these issues about to do with COVID, to do with the nitrates issue recently. So there's kind of some historic build-up, but it was Scott Pater Harris that built up that the reviews all well and good, but if you can't actually keep the staff, you're not going to make a difference. So recruitment and retention is kind of really important. Is that a leadership issue? Is that a culture issue? What is that means that the council can't hang on to staff in that key, really important area? And the council had tried outsourcing this, so that also kind of speaks to one of the other motions one of the motions that we were going to talk about. The council tried outsourcing this to a highly recommended organisation, and I think the technical term is they stuffed that up.
Yeah.
So in that respect, that didn't actually help. So, but are they the only contractor that can do it? I doubt it.
You've got to think not, haven't you? And that's where, and as you say, we'll get onto it. But again, one of the joys in somebody who historically has worked in procurement, when you outsource something, you've got to be very careful about the question that you ask of the team that you're outsourcing to, because if all you're saying is, actually, we'd like you to follow all the same onerous, complicated, and really kind of tedious processes that you follow internally, well, your outsourcer is going to be no faster than you and isn't going to have the knowledge and the expertise, so it's probably going to be slower. If you ask the question of, can you check these and make sure no laws are being broken, then if they know what they're doing from a legislation perspective, then you'd hope they could be a bit quicker.
You'd hope. Well, the interesting thing was that the administration committed to thought it was a good idea to keep giving continue to give updates on where each ward kind of was in their applications or their applications backlog. But it was interesting that they admitted to actually say how frequent those updates would be.
Right.
So regular updates will be a good idea. What's your definition of regular?
Yeah, once every 6 months. Yep.
So so that was that one. The next one we wanted to swing in on was a health and wellbeing strategy. I wanted to talk about this one briefly because I've got a clip from Kirsty Meller's objection to this statement. So with because of the rules of how the council works, so that's their constitution and their standing orders, items that are just a report back to the council aren't actually subject to a vote or a debate. So members only actually get to debate it if they object to it. So
Right.
So even if they actually patently agree with the report being produced, they can only have a conversation if someone actually objects to it. And that's the point that Councillor Meller makes in her. So let's listen to what she had to say about this one, and then talk through this one a little bit, because there's a quick kind of rundown of that one. But I think it's an interesting one when we think of the later motion where we talk about a constitutional review.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. Just to be absolutely clear, we are objecting in order to speak, and no matter how carefully people choose their words, sometimes they can always be twisted. So I'm making that clear that we are in full support of the health and wellbeing strategy. However, we feel it's important to highlight that as a local authority, we do not have an up-to-date poverty strategy. Instead, we've opted to tackle poverty in our health and wellbeing strategy. Social deprivation is a cause of ill health, and with the absence of a poverty strategy, it will be more difficult to implement the health and wellbeing strategy. Poverty is rarely the result of a single circumstance and often arises from numerous factors, and that does impact on the health and wellbeing of our residents. We must not lose sight of the fact that social deprivation and the cost of living crisis is severely damaging our communities.
So a very, very important point there to be made, that unless she'd taken an opportunity to use that mechanism, she wouldn't have had a chance to make that statement about actually the effect on health and well-being of poverty. And then, so the cabinet member responsible for wellbeing and social care is Jason Verzakali. And his response was he's happy to speak to other colleagues to look at addressing the concerns that Councillor Mellor raised. But then Council Leader Gerald Vernon-Jackson pointed out that there is a poverty strategy that was produced in November 2020. And then Councillor Mellor's retort to that was that having spoken to officers, they didn't seem to actually be aware of it. So hold that thought about doing something and not knowing it's actually been done and it not actually being reviewed, because that comes up again.
This is one of the dangers, isn't it, of a strategy document? Strategy documents in themselves are, it's actually quite easy to write. It's one of those things where, the number of times I've written my own strategy document about getting fit and losing weight, and it was so much easier to write the document than it ever was to cut down on all the things that are bad and increase all the things that are good.
Yeah, and would like writing a process. It's easy to define it's not easy, but you know what I mean. You can define a process, but unless someone continually reviews it over time, entropy ensues. People complicate things. People stop following the process, or they change things because there are different circumstances mean that things have to change and alter, and the work instructions or the processes don't evolve to cater for that. And again, that kind of speaks to the later motion about constitutional review. So the number of times you and I have sat through our summaries of full council meetings, and we're not sitting through them for 11, 12 hours like the people sat in the room are, although to be fair, it feels like I have by the time I've watched them and kind of made notes. But it's interesting the number of times that process and the rules of how the council does its business does actually come up. So it might sound like a quite an academic conversation, but actually it's quite fundamental to the way things get done. So yeah,
perhaps it's more fundamental as to whether they do get done, isn't it?
Well, yes, and I guess we'll kind of come to that a bit later on. But is the way we're doing things the way that we're supposed to do them, and is the departure from how we're supposed to do them and to the way that we're doing them now, is that an okay departure, i.e. is there a compliance issue about that departure, or does it just mean that the rules need updating to reflect common current practice? And that's something that's raised later on, for example, of our constitution doesn't allow any reference to digital meetings and how to hold them, or isn't specific about how votes are held within council groups. So there's some interesting but really actually quite fine points and fine details in there that were raised in something that maybe that's just me being sad, but they are actually quite important and intrinsic issues about how the council runs, how it's democratically accountable to the people that elect it, and how it demonstrates that it's doing things in the right way.
Well, and I think on this point, doesn't it go even deeper than that, which is, I'd ask the question of what use is a poverty strategy that nobody knows exists?
Yes. What value is that? The whole point of surely spending all of those hours creating a strategy is that it's a living document, that it's something you use.
Yeah, and you measure yourself against and say, well, okay, this is where we want to get to. This is where we are now, and these are the things that we want to change to get there. And then that sort of periodic, well, how are we doing against that? Otherwise what you've got is, somebody somewhere has been paid a chunk of money to craft a very well-meaning document that sits in a virtual filing cabinet somewhere.
Yeah, indeed. But do hold that thought, because
I shall retain it.
We return to it. So the next one I wanted to talk about was Solent Freeports.
Big shout out to Tony Restall, who we regularly, I wouldn't want to say that Tony's got a bit of an obsession about this, but He's very keen on the topic of free ports. So
He is.
he'd be delighted to know that this was on the agenda.
Indeed, and hopefully we do it justice by covering it. So the deadline for submission for the business case for the Solent Freeport to the government is April the 15th.
Yep.
So all of the council groups involved effectively need to kind of pass that work. If the Freeport business case is approved, then effectively Solent Freeport exists as an entity, and it has certain customs and tax powers for 25 years. Now, that's quite a good thing for Portsmouth City Council as the owner of Portsmouth International Port, which is a proposed customs site. And the Portsmouth City Council are also the owner and developer of Dunsbury Park in Havant, a proposed tax site. So both of those within the proposed Solent Freeport. So just to get some jargon out of the way, tax sites are basically places where businesses operating in tax sites have enhanced capital allowances, structures and buildings allowances, and stamp and land tax duty benefits, as well as employers' NI contribution relief and business rate relief. And customs sites have simplified customs procedures, allowing for duty exemption, deferred duty, duty inversion, and VAT deferral. Now, what's duty inversion, I hear you say? That's where the duty on something being imported into the country is higher than the duty paid on the finished product that's made from it, if that was imported.
Yep.
Right. So what customs sites allow you to do is effectively have a bonded warehouse where goods can come into that area for later use in manufacture and then for future export or just kind of future export. So Councillor Bosher, for the leader of the Conservatives, points out that Havant and Marchford in Southampton are also affected, and there's £220 million worth of benefits to the private sector, and predictions of creating 28,000 jobs. So immense opportunities, but all of the councils need to approve this. If one of them says no, basically the whole thing falls on its arse.
Yep.
But there's quite often some impression that free ports are basically a, Singapore on sea kind of no environmental regulation, no employment legislation, etc. But Councillor Smythe from the Labour group points out that there's misunderstandings about free ports, and that some people think companies operating in them are exempt from employment laws and steps to move towards zero carbon, etc. But free ports don't exempt operators from good practice, terms and conditions, and minimum wage, or implementing environmental policies. It starts to get a bit more political when Councillor Atkins goes a little bit off on one, saying that this is only possible because we left the EU. But then other people respond to him enough that he, you're shaking your heads. Okay, so we might have been able to do it when we were in the EU, but we didn't do it. So he kind of makes then unmakes his own point, which, bless him. But Council Leader Gerald Vernon-Jackson closes on basically it's not a silver bullet, but it is a great opportunity and it needs to be looked at. But to remember that the last free port in the UK was actually closed by the Conservative government in 2012. And although they do have a reputation of creating low wages in, for example, warehousing jobs, we wouldn't need to have been doing this if we'd not chosen to leave the customs union. So there was a bit of a revisit of a hint of the Brexit argument in this debate. But essentially, everyone seems to think, the idea of having loads of investment in the city and therefore allowing lots of growth and hopefully high-paid jobs and also therefore high rents for properties that the council owns and runs. What's not to like? Thanks very much, please.
Yeah, and I think this is where sometimes there is this kind of and free ports exist all over the world, and there are good and bad examples of both. And I think there is an element where if you look at if you look at it through the optimistic end of the telescope, this investment will bring jobs and will bring new businesses to Portsmouth. And there's always the, well, it's just a warehousing thing, isn't it? Well, no, not always, because you talked about inversion there, which is important because, if you're going to bring in a raw material and process it to be a finished good, then you've got to do something transformative to it, and that's a manufacturing job. And that brings engineering and quality and manufacturing as well as warehousing. So, there is an element of, I think that this is an excellent opportunity. I do struggle with it a little bit, because if I go back many years, I did, I did some work within a free port, but that was in Dubai. Now, the Dubai free port is enormous. And that's because fundamentally they had an awful lot of open space, a bleak desert, in which to, you know, you want air traffic, we'll just build 10 runways. You want sea traffic, right? We'll build another set of docks. And you want to throw up some new buildings? How many do you want? How big do you want them? Because we've got all this space, which Portsmouth clearly doesn't have. But there is an opportunity there. And I think it's one we should exploit. I think the only what could be a potential fly in the ointment is that I believe that DP World, who are the parent company to P&O, actually have a seat on the board of Solent Freeport. And I saw something from the Portsmouth Labour Party, who, following P&O's disgraceful treatment of their 800 workers who they dismissed this week, is challenging whether that should be the case. So, as you say, with a tight timeline for April the 15th, that there is a slight worry that that could derail the whole thing.
Well, yeah, are they the sort of organisation that we want to get into bed with, metaphorically speaking, bearing in mind that's how they treat their workforce? If part of the argument and rationale for this is the jobs, if they're going to treat their workers so poorly, that doesn't sound like such a great or secure or sustainable benefit, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I think there is this element of, again, I'm not neither of us are employment lawyers, but at first glance, what P&O has done seems to me to be completely illegal. We talk about protection for workers. You can't just sack people, or you can't, well, they haven't sacked them, they've made them redundant. And then, from what I read today, are intending to rehire all of those shipbound staff from Colombia, and effectively, they'll be on £2 an hour.
Yeah, it's not good, but it's why it's why the detail on these things are important, as well as a strategic plan, and it's also it's important to have an eye of the sort of companies and organizations that you're having a relationship with. Which is also a theme that comes up later on in one of the members' questions, the urgent question from Simon Bosher about the council's contract with Gazprom to provide gas for the council.
Yeah, so I mean, let's keep our fingers crossed, because I think ultimately, look, decent, well-paying jobs, manufacturing jobs in and around Portsmouth, I've got a big thumbs up for that. So that's the positive end. Others will say, oh, it's low tax, rubbish, and okay, maybe, but I generally think this is an opportunity that I hope we maximise.
Okay, so a bit more of a kind of swift on from a couple of things. Item 13, not on the motion, we didn't get to the motions yet, was about the carbon budget methodology. So that's a response from the cabinet member responsible, so that's Kimberly Barrett, to I think a previous question from Simon Bosher about basically what is the council doing about its net zero targets. Lots of love in the council chamber for the good things that are in the report, and it's showing how much work there is, and lots of appreciation for the officer that had been taken on to lead this work and to develop this work, who's got the basically, by the sounds of it, fantastic expertise and innovative qualities in this area to be able to help drive this along. And the work that that Cabinet Member Kimberly Barrett has done was much appreciated from members across the chamber. What Simon Boscher's response was, just his kind of closing retort was about, this is great because this is what we're doing, but what about what we're doing? What we're going to be doing now? What's the next thing? To which Councillor Barrett pointed out that, well, this is a report because of what you asked for. What we'll be discussing at a meeting later in the week is actually about what the new ideas are and what the kind of things going forward. But one of the things Councillor Boscher pointed out was, don't forget the contribution to the decarbonisation of using the Voi scooters.
Yep.
So quite a controversial thing within the city. There are concerns about accidents with them, but if it's getting people to not get in a car and basically zip up and down like a ninja with a backpack, then that's all for the good if that's a car off the road. But Councillor Barrett also pointed out one of the things she reported, which was very interesting and pleasing to hear, was that Portsmouth secured £16.2 million of the £67 million government funding, which means that so that's a huge chunk of it coming to Portsmouth. That means that households using the Switched On Portsmouth scheme will be able to secure up to £25,000 per home in energy efficiency measures. So again, if we're talking about cost of living, if we're talking about climate change, that's driving down bills, that's driving down carbon emissions. So that's a really good news story and something hopefully we can watch. And I see that Councillor Barrett has repeated her glowing praise for the officer concerned in the comments there. So good evening, Kimberly.
Yeah, and I think one of these things is very interesting, isn't it? At the moment, there's a lot of, there's a lot of kind of tension between taking the medicine and the cure. So, when we start thinking about the sort of green issues, and as you say, there's a lot of kind of grumpiness about the Voi scooters, but there's an element of, well, for every, let's presume that everyone taking a Voi scooter isn't running a petrol engine vehicle. That is a good thing. So I think I think as a society, it's one of the things we're really struggling with at the moment, is that tension between wanting to make the change, but the change being a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I think there's all sorts of we could get into the depths of I forget what it's called, but basically the drivers of change. You need to be able to envisage that a change is possible and that a change is needed, and that the current state is uncomfortable or unpalatable enough that it's worth you changing. But it was the way the conversation went in the chamber was, if I'm honest, a marked departure from the sorts of things that I've seen in political leaflets from certain parties in the past, which kind of sometimes seem to pit cycle users against car drivers.
Yep.
So if this is signalling an end to that sort of hostility, because we don't need to be enemies. We share this space, we share this damp island. Let's get on, and let's kind of find ways to make it work. So hopefully that's a glimmer of hope.
Yes.
So yeah. So there's that one. So we're getting to the motions. The first motion was, and we won't go into detail, which was the motion about basically getting more defibrillators set up and spread across the city. That's a Lib Dem motion proposed by Kimberly Barrett and seconded by Ian Holder from St Thomas Ward. The Lib Dems agreed to subsume the amendment from councillors Boscher and Gosling. And that was passed unanimously.
Yeah, excellent thing. Very simple pieces of kit, and just make a huge difference in terms of saving lives. So I was glad to see that one race through.
Indeed. So the second motion was about the elections bill. Now, this is the council, basically the Lib Dems bring into council to ask the council to make a statement to the effect of saying that they don't agree with the changes that the government are proposing to election legislation. And I've just got a little graphic here I'll pop that up for the people following on the live stream. But in short, the changes that the government are proposing are that voters by post, they'll be able to register online, vote, but there'll be a limit to the postal vote registration to 3 years before they need to apply again. So it can't be an open-ended application. There'll be a limit to the number of postal ballots any one person can hand in other than their own, to 2. So someone stumbling into a polling station with 15 postal ballots in their arms, no. And restricting who can hand in a postal ballot to a family member or a designated carer.
Yep.
So again, stopping that being basically just any random jobbie, and banning political parties and campaigners from handing completed postal votes and postal vote envelopes in, which seems an entirely sensible thing. I know that some parties already have an internal policy where basically they just don't touch them because it's just not worth the aggro of being accused of fiddling them.
Gerrymandering. Yep.
With regards to voting in person, requiring photo ID to vote. And if the voter does not have a photo ID, then they can apply for one from the council for free online. And similar to voting by post, proxy voting, limiting the number of people someone can be a proxy for to 2, or 4 if the voters are overseas, and allowing online applications. So I have to be honest, this is one of those ones where there's a lot of emotion to it. So shall we have a clip?
Yes.
From how people feel about it. So
it's a really important thing for democracy that people are able to vote. And vote easily. One of the reasons given for proposing this bill is about fraudulent elections, and yet actually the evidence in England is very, very low in terms of impersonation. But the effect potentially on people having to come to the polling station with either passport or driving licence, we know will discourage lots of people from voting. So I think we need to be making sure that we're not creating a bigger problem than the one that we're trying to solve. We know that those people who are on very low incomes don't have passports. They can't afford to go away. Passports cost over 70 quid now to get. And to say to people you have to have a passport, otherwise you can't come to vote, is going to discourage people from voting. Also, we know it'll discourage people who are younger, because people don't have driving licences, and therefore they're unable to be able to have that as a piece of photo ID.
The one issue that I think may have slightly slipped under the radar is the way in which the
Councillor
government is
Graham
seeking
Heaney from the Labour Party
direct the work of the Electoral Commission, the way it is wording its legislation. So what I've asked to do is that we agree right at the very end to, as I say, urge the government to reconsider those measures which seek to change the oversight arrangements of the Electoral Commission and to maintain the Commission's current independence and its accountability to all parties. There is obviously stuff about consultation, etc., but it's clearly trying to set conditions under which the Electoral Commission operates. And the commissioners are so concerned that they have written this open letter, which is published on their website. They say that it is our firm and shared view that the introduction of a strategy and policy statement enabling the government to guide the work of the Commission is inconsistent with the role that an independent electoral commission plays in a healthy democracy. This independence is fundamental to maintaining confidence and legitimacy in our electoral system. That view was echoed by the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, who produced a report just recently on the bill, and they also said that they thought that the government's approach to this, that they had failed to demonstrate that its proposed changes to the Electoral Commission are both, and I quote, necessary and proportionate, and therefore risk undermining public confidence in the effective and independent regulation of the electoral system. What they're doing here is effectively giving the regulated power over the regulator. The government insists that they're not proposing to really do anything terrible, and they're saying, oh, well, all they want to do is, and I'll quote here, they want to set priorities on things like impartiality, accountability, value for money, proportionality and consistency. Well, it's hardly likely that the Electoral Commission is going to go in for not partiality, unaccountability, poor value for money, disproportionality and lack of consistency. I mean, they're not going to do that. So you have to wonder what is going on here. Unfortunately, the government does have form, but in much more serious areas, as you can probably remember, the government sought to prorogue Parliament in 2019, and that was declared unlawful by the Supreme Court.
Where he said that it's an attack on democracy, but so is an opportunist person trying to vote twice. And my understanding is that this bill actually proposes, nobody's mentioned this, that it would have free ID provided for those who applied for it. So I don't think the idea of spending lots of money on a passport or a driving licence really holds up when the bill is saying that it would have free ID made available. Now, everything I've seen in the bill says that it will ensure that it does not deter people to vote, and that free ID point is a really strong one that we must make. Now, look, voter fraud is not widespread, Lord Mayor, but it does happen. It does happen, and there have been cases where it's pretty industrial, often orchestrated. I'm not sure if it came to fruition or not, by students online. And that's not to say, before there's mock outrage, not saying that all students do that, but it has happened, and there are cases where students will live somewhere, vote somewhere else. And I think if one person, just one person, robs another of their opportunity to vote through doing that, then it makes a mockery of the entire system. Now, look, we wouldn't claim outrage if we were asking somebody to provide photo ID to buy cigarettes and alcohol. So why, when it comes to protecting our democracy? What we really need, however, and Councillor Atkins touched on this, is a view that makes the whole system better work for individuals. I think what we really do need is a system which is easier to secure that disabled people have the opportunity to vote, in particular those that are visually impaired. The concern here is, of course, the cost. That's where I'm torn, I think. 180 million to do this is a huge concern. So for me, it's a head versus heart decision.
Yeah, this is an interesting debate. I'm kind of like on the fence with it because I think the cost of it is not something that I would like to support. But I think some of my colleagues have made a good point. To say that it doesn't happen is disingenuous. And the point that I really wanted to raise is it has happened here in Portsmouth. It might not have happened in terms of people going to the polling station and pretending to be somebody else. But voter coercion, even last year, Lord Mayor, absolutely did happen. And it was raised with the chief exec at the time and with the police, etc. And I can tell you now, some of the people and the whistleblowers that came forward that said, I'm being asked to sign over my vote via proxy forms.
So
I got Robert New at the end. I'm good. I'm getting better with voices. Who was third, championing the visually impaired?
So that was Terry Norton.
Oh, good man.
So it was Gerald Vernon-Jackson, the leader of the council, then Councillor Graham Heaney from the Labour Party, then councillors Terry Norton and Rob New from the Conservative group. So I mean, those are just a clip of some of the conversations that were there. But essentially, there was a bit of kind of to and fro. Councillor Atkins kind of also raised that the Electoral Commission's report saying that they do a survey and 30% of people are suspicious of the electoral process. But it's worth noting that that's just them being suspicious of it. Not that there's any evidence of that, anything to suspect. It's just that that's like people saying, I think there's lots of crime, but there isn't. But on the other hand, I'm also conscious that if we've got no way of checking who the identity of the person is that's rocking up to cast their ballot, how do we know if they're not being impersonated?
Well, and I actually wrote a piece on this back in 2016 because there was a trial over in Gosport where they trialed voter ID.
There was.
Yeah. And I wrote a piece for local news, Star and Crescent. My view on the photo ID piece is I actually think that I flip this on its head. The positive for me is about the ability to get free photo ID as part of this process, because increasingly there is a requirement for photo ID. You know, we get online deliveries, and if you use Amazon Fresh, the chap will ask me for photo ID if he's delivering alcohol. Well, I know I've got boyish good looks, but I promise I'm over 18. But he still wants photo ID. Now I'm lucky; I've still got a passport that's in date. But when that expires, I won't be getting a new one. You know, and the thing about young people, you know, I have a couple in my children who are of age. Now, they tell me it's not something I've indulged in many years, that if you want to go into Prism or Liquid and Envy or Pop World, I believe these are all clubs, you have to present photo ID. You know, they want to scan your photo ID, they want to take a photo of you, and if anything untoward happens afterwards, you know, that is a requirement for entering those establishments.
Yeah, I must admit my instinct to this is that it's basically identification cards by the back door. And that if we wanted to spend 180 million pounds on something, there are so many other things that we could spend it on. Some of the argument that kind of went along was talking about how people don't trust the voting process. It kind of tried to draw in the kind of the examples of the accusations of voting malpractice in the United States. But to be honest, you know, if you're excluding the deranged stuff that came from Trump, you know, then you know, at the end of the day, I think there are some historic accusations. I think it was Simon Bosher that made about apparently dead voters, obviously not the actual dead person themselves, but someone voting on behalf of a voter that was dead.
Yeah.
In elections historically. So yes, there are kind of ways that all of those things can be kind of can be brought up. But again, it's about our voting mechanism is from the 19th century.
Yeah.
It's the 21st century. You know, a pencil on a piece of paper might be unhackable, but it also doesn't reflect the world we live in.
No, and again, I guess, and I'll say it before you do, which is that you know, the last attempt of the government to get an app to work in terms of track and trace, it didn't come in at 180 million, did it? It was a little bit over budget from that. So, yes, I mean, for me, you know, look, it seems so 19th century to wander up at a church hall and say, I'm Brian and so is my wife, and somebody with a pencil and ruler then runs there down the list and finds you by your address and draws a line through you. You know, that just feels but it almost feels like 180 million to get us to 1984, where you've got an identity card. I'm not sure that's the greatest use of resource.
No, but again, is that just another government IT system that they balk at the idea of updating it because it's so expensive, but it just gets more and more out of date and therefore less and less useful and more and more irrelevant as time goes on. So because innovation happens, right? So I find it kind of interesting. I think this is one where I part from the party on, in the sense of I actually I've been to briefings from Demos. I've been to, you know, stuff like that at Lib Dem conferences, and yeah, I'd be concerned if there wasn't free voter ID available. But that is what happens in Northern Ireland, where they've had the requirement for voter ID for quite some time.
Yep.
Doesn't seem to have been a massive issue there, as long as it is accessible for people to be able to apply and get for this ID, and the ID is freely available and that doesn't disadvantage anybody, then that's great. So for me, the concern would be, what about the percentage of the population that can't go online or don't go online, that don't perhaps necessarily have some form of ID because they're, not being funny, traveling isn't in their future anymore. and they don't have kind of a valid passport, and they don't drive, or they have an expired driving license. So there are probably some people, and I think the stats that Gerald Vernon Jackson used in response to what Councillor Atkins was saying was that if the Electoral Commission found that between 92% and 96% of voters had some form of the ID that's going to be suitable, then that means something like between
4 and 8%. Yep.
1 point, yeah. So something between 1.9 and 3.8 million people in this country won't have that. So it's making sure that there isn't anybody that's disadvantaged from that. But in and of itself, is that robbing democracy, or is actually the point that Councillor Heaney made about the government wanting the ability to basically to wing clip its own the electoral regulator? I'm more concerned about that, if I'm honest.
Yeah, it's a who polices the police conversation, isn't it? And I think that, again, the voter ID thing, I can't get upset about, because it just seems part of modern life that you should, for so many things you need to produce photo ID to prove who you are and that you're eligible to take part. So how did the vote go?
Yeah. So the vote for that one, 21 for, 10 against, 4 abstained.
Passed.
So yes, so that passed.
So we're going to write to the government, and they're going to say,
to tell the government not to do the thing that the government said is their policy to do, and the government are going to no.
Yeah, duly noted. Is that one?
Yes.
Is that one going to appear on an election leaflet? Do we think?
I don't know that it's the thing that people get that excited about. Electoral reform is not what gets people out of bed. It's what gets a load of Lib Dems really excited.
They love it, don't they?
But the rest of the public, no, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Look at the PV referendum.
Yeah.
Anywho, so
Moving
that
on.
one went that way. 15C, brilliant motion from Councillor Tom Coles, sharing his personal story about the impact of his teenage diagnosis and support of ADHD, but then when he became an adult, that utterly fell away, and he had to fight for years to then get that diagnosis again as an adult and get the support that he needed. So that motion about supporting adults with ADHD was unanimously passed. So great motion there. 15D, insourcing. So Labour motion basically about asking for the council to, as a first port of call when any contract comes up for renewal, to consider actually bringing that in house. Now, to save us a bit of time, I won't play the clip, but
no, come on.
But you want me to play the clip?
No, let's not play the clip. So
Okay.
this is doubling down, isn't it? So so last election, the Labour manifesto, or the local Labour manifesto, was absolutely, their one of their flagship policies was, we insist that the council pays every single worker the living wage, even if that worker is working for a subcontractor or an outsourced provider. And the council said, can't do that. Can't make the outsourced provider pay them that. And if we did that in a oneer, it would be a X million pound shock to the system. And the only way we could do that would be by cutting services elsewhere. So it isn't going to happen. Didn't stop the Labour group kind of perpetuating that. So now they've gone still further to say, not only do we want the council to insist that the subcontract, but we end subcontracting and we bring everything in house.
Well, see, that's the interesting thing, is that it seems that different people seem to interpret this motion in a different way. So the motion was proposed by George Fielding, the leader of the Labour group, and he comments there about outsourcing not delivering in its promise to that competition would be a driver of efficiency and quality improvement and innovation. That the Institute for Government and Association of Public Excellence have collated large levels of data showing that lots of councils are bringing services back in with a report from the APSE showing that 77% of councils plan to bring back services in-house, and that between 2016 and 2018, 220 local government contracts were brought back in, and 78% of local authorities believe insourcing has saved money, while more than half said it's improved the quality of service while simplifying how it's managed. Now, what took place in the chamber was actually kind of an interesting kind of either an interpretation of the motion, so either that's a criticism of actually how the motion was written, or a deliberate interpretation of the motion along ideological lines.
Yep.
So the Lib Dems had put forward a motion to include, an amendment to include the third sector. So, for example, voluntary organisations like the Hive or like Pompey Moving On Project would also be considered. Because there are third sector alternatives rather than actually just bringing stuff in house.
Yeah.
There was lots of intervention from council member, from Councillor Norton, kind of listing. Sorry, how about Scott Peter Harris? Sorry, citing his professional sector experience and kind of questioning whether is the council really going to get into paying £4,000 a pop to give gas safe engineers their certification? Are we going to do all of those things? Are we going to be exposed to the fluctuations of copper and steel prices that are going to affect purchasing for household budgets in the household replacements? But also it was interesting that Councillor Atkins made the point that this is a bit kind of 60s, 70s, 80s, isn't it? And haven't what we've discovered, and even we, he said, the Conservatives have discovered that actually privatisation doesn't work for everything, and the existing Conservative government aren't exactly the most Thatcherite of governments, the right-leaning kind of fiscally prudent Thatcherite governments. And in fact, anything, that's perhaps why they're so popular and probably doing what Blair did, and perhaps the Labour group, quote unquote, should stop being so Corbynite about it and so absolute, like the unions are about it, and these things are kind of absolute. But what the Labour group continued to remind the members was that wasn't what they were saying. They weren't saying it should always be in-house. What they were saying is that actually at the start of a tender process that the council do put in enough people and resources to realistically to be able to explore the possibility of bringing something in-house if that is the best solution. So does that mean that the other groups were misunderstanding the motion on purpose, or does that mean that the motion was worded to allow that interpretation to take place? Or is it odds that the Lib Dems, Labour and the Conservatives all had a different interpretation of what the motion meant? But weirdly, they all broadly agreed that there wasn't a one-size-fits-all solution. And it was even Councillor Atkins, who it's fair to say isn't a card-carrying socialist.
No.
Who was saying that you've got to kind of find the right thing. And I think it was Scott Peter Harris that was talking about the flexibility of the solution. But
yep.
The proposition in itself was kind of wrong, that you need to make a decision on a case-by-case basis. So and there was also contributions from both Councillor Bosher and Councillor Symes, but Councillor Fazackley were kind of rounded things up quite nicely by saying that usually we all make speeches and they don't really make a difference because we all effectively come here with our minds made up or being told which way we need to vote by our parties. But actually, I've listened to all of your relevant points and I've been swayed, and I'm not going to vote for the amendment that my party's put forward. And that basically it all comes down to flexibility. He said that he was going to abstain, and what he said was it's probably a wimpy Lib Dem way out of it, but I've been swayed by the debate, quote unquote. So,
and that's never a
but
bad...
it was just weird that but it was weird that actually aside from the ideological claims of the politics, actually what people were saying wasn't that far apart. It's just a shame that they couldn't find a way to meet in the middle.
No, but post-match, I've seen an exchange between a Labour councillor and a Lib Dem councillor, which was so along ideological lines. It was the Lib Dems were against this because they don't want to pay You know, they don't want better terms and conditions for the people working for the council. And so I think any claims that, oh no, this wasn't an ideological motion, I'm sorry, but I think that's disingenuous. I think this was an ideological motion, and it you know, I would agree with Councillor Atkins that it's back to the 70s and 80s demarcation of labour nonsense, where you've got one of the advantages of outsourcing is you outsource to a very big organisation that have lots and lots of people that can surge when demand is high and can put their people elsewhere when demand is low. And it's not a one size fits all, and it's not always the perfect situation. But to bring everything back in house, where you've got very well paid council employees who will be sat there waiting for something to happen. It's a nonsense.
So, so the amendment fell with 8 voting for and 18 against, and then the motion, as originally submitted, that then fell with 10 voting for, 15 against, and 7 abstentions.
Yeah, and for me, look, and this is where the ideology of, well, do you want people to have different, you want them to have better pay terms and conditions, and it's what I touched on earlier about this tension. Well, the answer is yes. Well, if you bring a service in and you pay the individuals better pay terms and conditions, that comes out of the council's budget. So hooray for those people. The downside is that the council's got to cut that money from somewhere else. And that means a reduction in services. And I think this double think that Portsmouth Labour have, which is that all of the people on low wages can and should be paid more, and magically the money will be found from somewhere. I think it's so disingenuous, and this is 5-star leaflet fodder, isn't it?
Well, it was interesting that rather than subsume an amendment that the Labour group said that wasn't needed, and therefore allowing it to get the support and pass, does it work electorally? Does it to a certain number of their audience, their constituents? Does it play better for them to be able to say basically, oh look, the big awful Lib Dems and the Conservatives kind of ganged up on us again and didn't allow us to do what we wanted to do? But actually, when you listen to the debate in the chamber, when you weed that out of it, there was a lot more agreement than there was disagreement. And that's the sad thing, is that almost because of the politicization of the point, a reasonable compromise wasn't made. And I think that was kind of what Councillor Frazakali was saying, was that there was actually a missed opportunity there.
Yeah.
But there we go.
But which there's always going to be, if the if the purpose of your motion is to, it's almost, I'd even go further to say, well, actually, did they want it to pass? I'm not sure that they did. I think there's more political capital out of it being tabled and rejected than there is in it being tabled and accepted.
Well, that's deeply cynical.
I think it is. But to be honest, Simon, and this is where, again, I'm cynical, because before the Labour published their, Portsmouth Labour published their manifesto last year, that point on all workers should receive the full living wage had been to council, had been rejected. All of the working out had been shown as to why it couldn't pass, yet it still appeared as a manifesto pledge.
Well, if that's their manifesto pledge, then if that's what they, at the end of the day, if that's what they truly believe, and they put that as a manifesto, and then people vote for it, then they've got a mandate to push for it. I'd argue, but also that was secured for a year as part of the budget amendment.
Yes.
So in a sense, although it didn't pass council motion, in the end, they did get their way.
Partially.
Yeah.
Well,
So
to be honest, Chum, just looking at the clock, time has run away with us.
yes. So yeah, we've got. Do we want to quickly talk about the constitutional review and the local plan?
I think it's pick one of the two. The local plan
Okay.
was a lively one, wasn't it?
It was, but we did a lot of lineup at the beginning of the episode for both. So it feels, but what should we do? We could ask our listener.
Well, tell you what, as it stands, we actually don't have a show planned for next week at the moment.
Mhm.
Why don't we hold them both over and give them the airtime they deserve, with some other little sprinklings added in to make a buffet of enjoyment for next week's show.
That sounds like a good idea. Let's
You-
go with that one.
You've been listening to a meandering version of the Pompey Politics podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris.
And I've been Simon Sansbury. Join us next week for the last two parts of that and whatever else we're going to fill the episode with. But also don't forget that we're also having we're arranging hustings. So we've got our first hustings on April the 3rd, 6:27, which is a Cosham hustings. If you want your candidate to be in the hustings, get them to give us a bell.
Poke them, prod them, encourage them.